Ever tried reading while jogging, cooking, or even juggling flaming torches? Yeah, it doesn't end well. But with audiobooks.com, you can conquer books without the circus act. Dive into over 450,000 titles, including more than 10,000 free ones. Get hooked on a bestseller, find your next obsession, or finally read that classic you've been avoiding since high school. And here's the inside scoop. Sign up today for a free 30-day trial and snag your first 3 audiobooks on the house. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.
I want to welcome you all to a live episode of All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm not used to people looking at me when I say that. I am Kemper Donovan, and I am so thrilled to be here in Torquay, in Devon, on the south coast of England, right smack in the middle of what I've come to think of very fondly as Agatha Land, a happy place for me, and I know for many of you as well. It is Thursday, September 14th, and just as I did last year, I am hosting this episode live from the Spanish Barn, one brisk and extremely uphill walk away from where Agatha Miller grew up at her beloved home of Ashfield. For those in the audience who don't know who I am, for 5 years I co-hosted the All About Agatha podcast with my beloved co-creator and co-host, Catherine Brobeck. Tragically, Catherine passed away at the end of 2021. So for almost 2 years now, believe it or not, I have been hosting the podcast solo. I'm also a writer, and my debut mystery novel, The Busybody, is coming out this January in the United States. Sadly, I do not have a UK publisher lined up yet. So if anyone has any ideas about how to make that happen, please come see me afterward. You think I'm joking, but I'm not. Really want to be published in the UK. So even though the podcast project of ranking all 66 of Agatha Christie's novels has been completed, I will continue to generally yammer on about Agatha Christie to anyone who will listen. And tonight, that includes all of you. So first, I just want to welcome all of you here in the audience who made the journey to see me and my fellow panelists in person. You are very, very much appreciated. And technological gods willing, I will be broadcasting this episode out to all my podcast listeners. That did not go so well last year, so this very well may just be a live event that all of you are privy to. But let's hope for the best. I honestly don't know which way it's going to go. We are technically recording. We'll see. I want to introduce my fellow panelists, my dream team of agathologists who have assembled like literary Avengers in our collective pursuit of the truth. First up, all the way on my left, your right, we have John Curran, the godfather of Agatha Christie scholarship. Not at all in a criminal syndicate sort of a way. I actually like to think of John as Agatha Christie's translator, in that he has single-handedly pored over the scores worth of exercise books Christie used to jot down her notes, her thoughts, and anything else while she was working through her mysteries. Without John, we simply wouldn't have the understanding that we do of how Christie did what she did. His Agatha Christie's Complete Secret Notebooks is an essential reference for me and for anyone who considers themselves a scholar of Christie. Next, to my immediate left, we have Mark Aldridge, who has written 2 books about Christie that I've turned to countless times on the podcast. His first is Agatha Christie on Screen, an encyclopedic account of the many film and TV adaptations of Christie's work. His second is Agatha Christie's Poirot, the greatest detective in the world, which centers on Monsieur Poirot, but of course. And I am thrilled to report that Mark has a new book coming out in June of next year. You could probably guess what it's about. It is about Miss Jane Marple. And how is this for a title? Agatha Christie's Marple, Expert on Wickedness. I'm already hooked. Our next panelist is Jamie Berntal-Hooker, right next to Dr. Curran there, who is a Christie scholar whose book, Queering Agatha Christie, is one of my personal favorites in the world of Christie scholarship. Last year, he published Agatha Christie, A Companion to the Mystery Fiction, and he's also edited 2 different books about Christie, compiling essays from scholars dotting the globe. Jamie is one of the organizers of the Agatha Christie Conference, which brings together scholars and fans of Christie, the latest iteration of which I attended earlier this week in lovely Exeter. It was an absolute blast. I cannot recommend it enough. Jamie is also a mystery writer in his own right, whose satirical Jessica Brick series is an especial delight for fans of Christie. It certainly was for this fan of Christie. Speaking of mystery writers, my final co-panelist here is Victoria Dowd, a novelist many of you are sure to know. Her debut novel, The Smart Woman's Guide to Murder, won the People's Book Prize for Fiction in 2021 and was also named In Search of the Classic Mysteries Novel of the Year. She has 3 more books in the Smart Woman series, and she was also awarded the Gothic Fiction Prize in 2019 for her short fiction, which has been published in various literary journals and magazines. Like me, she went to law school, though unlike me, she actually practiced law, working as a criminal law barrister for many years and even appearing at the Old Bailey, which may or may not become relevant later on. Stay tuned. And she is a massive Agatha Christie fan. Just go to her website and her bona fides are up there as a massive Agatha Christie fan. Okay, so the task that I have set before us today is that together we here in the Spanish Barn are going to crown Agatha Christie's greatest short story. Last year we crowned her greatest novel, and this year it is time to shine some scholarly light on Christie's short stories, which don't get nearly as much attention as the novels. So we are going to rectify that right now, and here is how it is going to work. Each panelist, plus myself, has already identified their top 3 Christie short stories that they love, which I have then compiled into a master list. There was some significant overlap in our choices, so among the 5 of us, we have 9 titles total to consider. And I should say, these were the 3 stories that they consider the greatest short stories of Agatha Christie, which is not necessarily to be confused with short stories that we love. Perhaps that will come up at some point in our debate. So we are going to duke it out among these 9 titles by way of a balloon debate until we have a winner. In each round, we'll pit one title against another, starting with the titles that received the fewest nominations, and working our way upward to the titles that received the most. Each panelist will have no more than 1 minute to argue why one of these short stories should be thrown out and the other not thrown out. I will be timing everyone, including myself. Then whichever story has won over a majority of us will go on to the next round. And so on until we are left with 2 short stories. At the end of that round, it will be up to all of you, the live audience here, to make the final decision as to which of these 2 stories wins the crown of Agatha Christie's greatest short story. Last year we had a little bit of a disagreement. The audience picked a different book from what we picked, but you know what? We went with it because those were the rules. So, and then there were none has the crown at the International Agatha Christie Festival. Afterward, I'll have some closing remarks, and then we'll do a Q&A with whatever remaining time we have. And just please know you don't have to limit your questions to the titles or topics that we discussed during the debate. So, before we get started, I can't help pointing out that in March of 1927, just before the final volume of Sherlock Holmes' short stories, The Casebook of Sherlock Holmes, was due to be published in book form, the Strand held a competition for its readers. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle himself would rank his top 12 Sherlock Holmes short stories, and whichever fan guessed the author's list most nearly would win £100 and an autographed copy of his autobiography, Memories and Adventures. £100 is about £8,000 today, by the way. I have no idea who won that contest, but I do know that The Speckled Band was Doyle's #1 short story, for anyone who's wondering. And the letter that he wrote explaining why he selected the 12 titles he did is quite charming and fascinating, and I find myself wishing Agatha Christie had done something similar. But hold on a second, she actually did do something similar. In 1974, just 2 years before Christie's passing, given that she wouldn't be producing an original work for pretty much the first time in over half a century, discussions took place between Christie and her publisher Collins about what they would put out for that year's Christie for Christmas. And as relayed by John Curran in his Agatha Christie Secret Notebooks, Dame Agatha sent Billy Collins a list of her own favorites among her early stories. So these are Agatha Christie's own favorite early short stories. Already, this is a list with a pretty major caveat, since it heavily favors those early stories of hers that tended toward the supernatural, as opposed to the ratiocination we would all come to know and love her for. I'm guessing that at least some of you are not all that familiar with many of these stories, and I'm shocked to admit to you all that just one of these 14 short stories made the cut for the list that my co-panelists and I are about to run through. I'm not going to tell you which one. I'm going to keep you in suspense about that until we get there. But given that The Christie for Christmas in 1974 ended up being a collection of Poirot's early cases, none of which are on this list, I wouldn't feel too badly if these titles aren't immediately springing to mind. Okay, one note about spoilers. We aren't going to go out of our way to spoil these stories, but it's awfully difficult not to spoil certain aspects of the mysteries when talking about why or why not they work as well as they do. So please know this conversation is going to get a bit spoilery. I personally feel like the spoiling of a Christie short story, while unfortunate, is nowhere near as grave an offense as spoiling a Christie novel. Kind of like a Class C misdemeanor as opposed to a Class A felony. So, feel free to slap our wrists after the talk, or at least you can slap my wrist. I don't want to speak for my co-panelists' wrists. And this is my final note before we get started, I promise. Last year, when we performed the same exercise for the novels, I did not bother summarizing each novel since they were so widely known. But since the short stories are slightly less well known, I'll start off each round of debate with just a précis of what the story is to jog any memories that might need jogging and make sure we've all got our bearings. Okay, so we are going to get started, and our first offering is Murder in the Mews. So, Murder in the Mews is, of course, the titular story of the Murder in the Mews collection, which first was published in 1937. And in this story, a woman is discovered shot dead in Bardsley Garden Mews on Guy Fawkes Night. We get a lot of Inspector Japp in this story, which is always a bonus, especially since the more he and Poirot investigate, the more confusing matters get. Why was the victim holding a gun in her right hand and yet shot in her left temple? Why was she withdrawing money from her account in a manner consistent with blackmail? And why is her roommate taking things out of their flat and disposing of them in the lake on a nearby golf course? So that is our first offering, which will be pitted against our second, Triangle at Rhodes. And by the way, these are both, of course, novellas, which are long short stories, so this is a little bit of a technicality including it as a short story, but I think it's fair. This is our battle of the novellas here. So Triangle at Rhodes, all in the same collection, the Murder in the Mews collection. This is the one that gets known as the novella that was kinda sorta expanded into Evil Under the Sun, even though the puzzle mechanism in this novella functions very differently from the one in that novel. Poirot is en vacances in Rhodes when he bears witness to a deadly love triangle involving the beautiful Valentine Chantry, who ends up dead from a poisoned pink gin cocktail. So those are our two short stories that we are going to be debating right now, and I am going to use my magical smartphone here to time myself because I will be starting this round. We will be alternating who starts each round because that is the fair way to do things. So here goes. As much as I adore Triangle at Rhodes, I'm going with Murder in the Mews here because I think what I love most about Agatha Christie's short stories overall is that they allow her to experiment a little, to go rogue and do things she wouldn't necessarily be able to do in a full-length novel. And the central trick here is such a typically brilliant Christie inversion. Hold on, here comes a spoiler. Instead of a murder made to look like a suicide, we've got a suicide made to look like a murder. So there's actually no murder at all, just a massive cover-up. And I think Christie was smart to make this into a short story because that might have been a deflating solution for a novel. So this is just a perfect short story for me. And I believe this is the reason it was included within the first season of David Suchet's Poirot, actually, to give a sense of the breadth of cases that they would do, that it wouldn't just all be straightforward murder cases. And finally, this story has an excellent example of Christie misdirection involving those golf clubs and that attaché case. She's begging us to look at one, but the crucial clue lies elsewhere. All right, I'm done in just under a minute. Mark. you're up.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the loser, actually, which is Triangle at Rose, which I'm going to say is brilliant and I love, and I think it's got a really excellent link between characters and the mystery, and that is when Agatha Christie's at her best, that you can believe in those characters and yet they're placed into a mystery that you can really sort of get along with and believe in. So I think Triangle at Rose is a brilliant story, but I also don't think it's a patch on Murder at the Mews. So Murder at the Mews is the one that I pick out of these two, because Murder at the Mews has got much better atmosphere. It's also longer and it's much better example of where you can have a bit more expansion, and yet, like you said, Kemper, you don't have to go all the way to a novel for it to work. So I love Murder at the Mews for its characters, but also for the fact that its mystery is so clever. You've given it away, but that's such a clever thing to do, to have a suicide that looks like a murder. And there's all sorts of moral questions about that as well. So yeah, for me, Murder at the Mews very much bears much more rereading.
All right,
full stop.
Fantastic, thank you. All right, Victoria.
Do I just go with that, or I
Yes.
pick one, or?
Yes, yeah, whichever one, pick whichever one.
Oh my God, it's like being asked to choose your favourite child. So I just choose which one I think is best. Oh, I'm sorry, Kemper. I like Murder in the Mews a lot, primarily because of the plot, and I never saw it coming. Whereas in Triangle at Rhodes, I kind of, I don't know. And there were various bits in that where I kind of thought, no, I didn't like. And I hated Valentine Chantry, and I was glad she died.
All right.
I'm sorry.
No, excellent. Jamie.
Be prepared to try me for treason, because I would pick Triangle at Rhodes. I do obviously adore Murder in the Mews, and I think it's interesting that other writers haven't copied that excellent trick that she uses there, like they have copied all her other excellent tricks. Is it because it's just not such a well-known story? It's such a good twist and is such clever plotting. But Triangle at Rhodes, what I love there is that she uses the unexpected alliance, which was almost her trademark, something she was so good at, the unexpected romantic couple who you don't sort of suspect of being what they are. And it's just really good and clever and very pretty scenery in the story. It's just a nice story and a perfect length.
It is very classic, Christie. All right, John Curran.
I'm going to opt for Murder in the Mews. Much as I admire Triangle at Rhodes, and it was also the first time that I discovered that at the time Rhodes belonged to Italy, not Greece. But much as I admire it, and I admire the way that she tweaked it and changed it and turned it into Evil Under the Sun, Murder in the Mews is a wonderful expansion of a very early short story, The Market Basing Mystery, and unlike some of her other expansions, it's not just extra words are put in. She developed the plot elements, not only the very clever idea of murder disguised, or suicide disguised as murder, but the right hand, left hand, which is a cliche of detective fiction going back to beyond Sherlock Holmes. But she does it in such a subtle way, and yet when you look back on it, every clue that you need to work out the right-handedness or left-handedness. And that was the first time also, I'm a very innocent Irish Catholic, so I didn't know you had such things as left-handed golf clubs. So I thought that was a really...
Time.
Oh, okay. See if
I'm ruthless. I'll even cut off Dr. Curran. All right, well, I believe that Murder in the Mews has it at a vote of 4-1. So, Murder of the Mews is going to up. I remember you tried to do this last year too, applaud after every round. Believe me, we have too many rounds. We'll applaud at the end. Hold your applause, please. All right, Murder in the Mews is going to go up against The Idle House of Astarte. So this is a Miss Marple short story. It is the second story within the 13 Problems collection, of which was published in 1932. The collection, rather, was published in 1932. Sir Richard Haydn invites a party down to his estate, which features a number of Stone Age relics and a grove of trees said to be an authentic grove of the ancient goddess Astarte. So when Sir Richard stumbles in the middle of this grove in front of his guests and is found to have been stabbed through the heart with no evidence of a knife or other weapon, it seems as though something supernatural must be afoot. Or is there another explanation? All right, Dr. Curran, you're up first on this one.
there's no contest here for me. The Idle House of Astarte is quite an entertaining little trifle, but for me, that's all it is. And I'm very dubious about the method of murder. Well, I don't want to give it away, clearly, but I'm not sure that you would get away with that method of murder with literally an audience watching you. It's very much of its time, a house party where they all dress up and act like the idiot. And the supernatural element is quite well done, but there's absolutely no contest. Murder in the Mews.
All right. Jamie?
So when you gave us the list of all the stories we'd nominated, I had to double check whether I'd nominated The Idle House of Astarte, because I do, and I wasn't one of those who'd nominated it, but I do absolutely love it, partly because it's so of its time. It's this wonderful capsule of Christie changing her style and still relying on her Victorian magazine influences and also developing her own voice. That said, Murder in the Mews I will choose because it's so good, so innovative, as mentioned. Not as good as Triangle at Rhodes, but I accept the mob rule, it's fine.
All right. Thank you, Jamie.
Well, this is the one that I did nominate because I think it's a fantastic plot. It's an impossible crime. Who doesn't love an impossible crime? And of course, it does stretch the boundaries of possibility a little bit. But you are in this wonderful silent grove at this bizarre little folly, the Idle House of Astarte. And you know when there's an unnecessary folly appearing, there's going to be trouble. And that's fantastic. And she's dressed so beautifully. Diana Ashley, this beguiling goddess of Astarte, who says, "Step any closer and I will smite you with the power of Astarte." And he gets smited. In the middle of this clearing, he's stabbed to death. There's nobody anywhere near him, and there's no weapon. How fantastic is that? And there's a fancy dress party. And of course, with Agatha, the costumes are a key plot point as well. It's wonderfully atmospheric as well, you know.
All right. Thank you. Mark Aldridge.
So we're going to have a fight, Victoria.
I know.
This is the one that, when it was on the list, I was like, oh, that was a bit of a shock. Because this is a really fun story. I absolutely agree. And there's loads to enjoy about it. Just like Murder in the Mews, it's got really good atmosphere. For me, there's this thing about when you read detective fiction, and it's impossible to describe or sort of analyse, which is people's idea of believability are very, very different, right? So a story that I read and that Kemper reads, you might believe in something that something could really happen, and I might go, absolutely no way, and vice versa for other things. For me, on this is an absolutely no way example. But I also think it's a really good example of a story that's originally written for a magazine. Like, it's meant to be a bit of fun, and it's just not meant to possibly be analysed about 90 years later by the rest of us. But nevertheless, we've done it. It's still great fun. You should still read it, but after Murder in the Mews.
Oh boy, okay, well, we have a tie of 2-2, so I am going to be the deciding factor here. And I have to say, to myself, I love me some Miss Marple, so I'm actually going to go with the House of Astarte here. I love the fact that it is audacious, actually. I love the fact, because she often did do that with the short stories. She was doing something that she never would have done with the novels, and sometimes they can be a little bit silly, and you might roll your eyes a little bit, but they're still brilliant. And what I really love this story for is the fact that it does feature one of Christie's best tricks, which is a time shift hiding in plain sight. And you can trace a line from tricks like this to a trick that she did, for example, in Mrs. McGinty's Dead. She actually did the exact same trick in Mrs. McGinty's Dead. And what I love about being able to see them in situ in a short story is that it's almost in relative isolation in a short story. So you can sort of gain a better understanding of how exactly this trick works. It's almost like a primer for what she does for the novel. So, and this is also a great example of the supernatural red herring, which Christie would do time and time again. I think she does it so well because it seems so supernatural, and then it's so not. So, Idle House of Astarte it is. It wins. All right, so that is going to go up against another...
No. It was 3-1. It was 3-1 before you went, friend.
Oh, it was? Oh my God, I thought that...
1, 2, 3.
Who did I think that... Well, I know that John voted for Murder in the Mews.
I said nice things about it. So.
Oh, but you didn't vote for it. I thought that...
I'm sorry. I feel like I betrayed you.
I thought goodness. Oh my God, I was so close. Miss Marple, I tried to pull a fast one over on all of you, I guess. Apparently, I'm not Dark Marple. I don't have her powers. Okay, well then we have Murder in the Mews still alive against Death by Drowning. So this is our next Miss Marple short story here. And hey, guess what? You might remember this title from Agatha Christie's list, because this is the one title that also made it on Agatha Christie's list. So this is the last story within the 13 Problems collection. Did young Rose Emmett, an unmarried woman whose father runs the village pub and who found herself in the family way, did she die by suicide, or, as Miss Marple is convinced, was she murdered? All right, Mark, why don't you start us off on this one?
Yes. Well, this is a tougher one, actually, but for me, Death by Drowning is the best of the two. I love Death by Drowning. Death by Drowning, interestingly, if you're me, was the one short story that got really close to being made for the Joan Hickson series. It started to be scripted, and then Joan Hickson said, I'm not doing short stories, actually. And I can see why, because it's got depth. Like, the characters have got depth. It's very similar to Nemesis in lots of ways, and the adapter actually noticed that and said that this idea that love can be lots of different things, doesn't have to be romantic love, and that jealousy can come into that in really interesting ways. I love the characterization in this. I absolutely believe in the characters, and I think it's a really neat little mystery. I think it is really unfairly forgotten because it's stuck at the end of the 13 Problems and isn't part of the rest of them. Yes, it's one of my favourites, Death by Drowning.
So you were voting for Death by Drowning?
I am voting for Death by Drowning.
I'm just going to ask everyone at the end of every single time. All right. Okay, sorry.
I think I would probably have to go with Death by Drowning as well. I never saw it coming, the ending at all, even reading it a second time around, because I forgot what happened the first time around. But I love the bit with the wheelbarrow / pram, and I just never saw that little bit coming, that somebody has seen someone with a wheelbarrow, and it's actually this lady with a pram, and you can really visualise this terrible old woman and she's actually not that old. I think she's about 40 years old.
I think she's 40, like 40 years flat. Yeah.
And she's in love with somebody who, why shouldn't she be in love with this amazing guy who builds her bookcases in her house, and she can't. And I love the fact that the alibi is set up for him, and she's so kindly done that for him. But in fact, she's been giving herself a bit of an alibi, which I think is very, very clever.
Very clever. All right. Thank you, Jamie.
Oh, I shall be contrarian, and I am so sorry to Agatha, who I didn't realise had chosen this as one of her favourite books, short stories. I love Death by Drowning. I don't think it works as a short story, and for this reason, it's too good. The plot is very good. The psychology is so much deeper than it is in so many short stories, and yet you contrast that with Miss Marple being surprisingly playful and treating murder as a game in the way she has done in the Tuesday Night Club. And that jarred for me as a reader, just the sort of psychological aspect of it. Miss Marple treating murder more lightly than I think she does in her novelistic career. So for that reason, I will go back to Murder in the Mews.
Okay. Thank you, Jamie. John?
And so will I. I have to admit, I'm amazed that this story was nominated because, first of all, it drives my OCD over the top because it's not remotely similar to any of the 13 Problems in presentation and the way it's given to the reader. There are absolutely no clues, and I know Miss Marple must be psychic for a lot of her career, but how she possibly worked this out is beyond the wit of man. So, given that, I can't see how it's a proper detective story at all. The one thing that I do admire about it is it's one of her very few forays into the working class. I know you're not supposed to say that nowadays, but we all know what I mean. I feel I've crossed over into the Twilight Zone when I got the list and saw Death by Drowning, because not only do I think it's the weakest Miss Marple story, it's one of Agatha Christie's weakest short stories at all. So wow. I'm going for Murder in the Mews.
Tell us what
keep going.
Okay.
That's the shock.
I just want to check this with everyone. I do have a tie right now. Okay. And this is why, this is such a past-dependent sort of a thing, because I was all ready to elevate Miss Marple, but when it's between Murder in the Mews and Death by Drowning, I am going to have to go with Murder in the Muse, actually. So Death by Drowning, I have the same issue with the fact that it's tacked on to the end of the 13 Problems. It's always annoyed me, the sort of obsessive in me, because we have the 6 stories at the first dinner party, and then the second set of 6 stories at the second dinner party, and then it just gets tacked right on. That is not the story's fault necessarily. I will make a comparison to another Miss Marple short story, Ingots of Gold, for why I think this is a weak Miss Marple mystery. In Ingots of Gold, the answer depends on the fact that Miss Marple knows that gardeners don't work on Whit Mondays. That is something that you, the reader, might have known. I mean, not in 2023 probably, certainly not me, American 10-year-old reading that story, but you could have known it. Here, her knowledge hinges on the fact that she's aware of the whereabouts, generally, of the murderer, and she just knows it, because she does, but there's no way that we, the reader, could have known it. So it's not as active or robust of a mystery for that reason. So I'm going to give it to Murder in the Muse. There we go. All right, our next title is yet another Miss Marple, a short story. This is The Affair at the Bungalow. This is the second to last story within the 13 Problems collection, in which Jane Hellier, a seemingly airheaded actress, tells a story about a young man accused of stealing some very fine emeralds off an actress acquaintance of hers from that actress's Riverside bungalow. The young man claims he went to this bungalow to visit Jane herself, but Jane has no idea who he is or what he's talking about. And when the man comes face to face with Jane, only then does he realize that it was some other woman who he met who was pretending to be Jane. So what gives here? Is this man lying? Is he being set up? What's happening? Jamie, which will it be for you?
It will be Miss Marple. The Affair at Bungalow, of those two, I would choose this one because it's fun and it's interesting and it's different. And compared to the other 13 Problems story we had, which was from the first set of problems, this one is, I think, much more assured. This half of stories, Miss Marple is kind of in it from the beginning. She doesn't just pop up at the end and say, oh, well, actually, this is how it happened. She drives the conversation, and so it's nice to get to know Miss Marple. But also Jane Hellier is such a fabulous character, and it's just really nice to get to know her and how she narrates stories and tries to obscure facts and gets confused with herself. And yeah, it's just really entertaining to read, and that's often what you want from a short story.
All right. John?
I'm quite equivocal about this story because I think I forgive everything in it for the twist at the end, which is thematically very similar to Poirot's Wasp's Nest. But for once, and I hate to have to say this, I find the story quite confusing because it's Agatha Christie telling a story and someone within the story is telling a story about someone telling a story. So if you were to synopsize it, you'd have your work cut out for you. But I forgive everything for the twist at the end, but I'm still coming down on the side of Murder in the Muse.
Murder in the Muse. Okay. Victoria?
I'm still going to go with Murder in the Muse. The Affair at the Bungalow irritates me enormously. Jane Hellier, just, she's such an airhead in it. And yet, she has devised this magnificent plan that she's going to put into operation, which is so complicated that it's confused John Curran. I mean, that's just the most ridiculous thing. It's a silly story. It's a silly story. There is no Affair at the Bungalow. It's really just totally annoying.
So you're Murder in the Muse?
Yes, I would say
All
so.
right. Mark?
Yes, I'm Murder in the Muse as well. And really for pretty much the same reason as everybody else. I'm not actually that down on this story, but I did have to read it more than once. And there's this thing about when you read an Agatha Christie, you want Agatha Christie to be one step ahead of you, but you don't want her to be in like the next country. You want to absolutely feel that you're just almost there with it. And I had to reread it to really work out what had gone on. But, I mean, that sort of shows her genius, that she can be there, and it does work, but I think you're perhaps expecting something a bit more simplistic going into it, and when you get to the end of it, it's almost like a sort of a commentary on itself, the interior mystery, and there's an exterior mystery. It's tough to follow, so Murder in the Muse, because that's great.
All right. Well, Murder in the Muse is going to win this round, but I am going to make an impassioned defense for The Affair at the Bungalow, which is which is what I nominated. And I love it basically for all the reasons that Victoria doesn't like it. It's all about Jane Hellier for me. I love how we get that Christie humor at the beginning when she starts by saying, oh, well, it's my friend. Something happened to my friend. And everyone else is like, how long is it going to take her to forget that she said my friend and just start saying her own name? And sure enough, she does. But by the end of the story, what we realize is that she has actually been extremely cunning. And that this whole time she's been telling them a story about something that hasn't happened yet, which she herself has been planning. She is workshopping this intrigue. So a future crime, we're practically in Minority Report territory here. This is Christie doing something very complicated and experimental again, but I love when she does that in the short stories. I think this is Jane Hellier on the level of Jane Wilkinson. From Lord Edgware Dies. And what I also love is at the end of the story, she has great respect for Miss Jane Marple because she says, well, I'm not going to do it because there might be other Miss Marples out there. That's how the final line of the story, and it's fantastic. But alas, enough of you are wrong about that we are going to say goodbye to The Affair at the Bungalow. And Murder at the Mews is really staying strong here. Murder in the Mews is going to go up against The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding. Okay, so the original shorter version of the story was first serialized all the way back in 1923. The expanded version was most famously published in the 1960 collection, The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding and a Selection of Entrees. So, what does an Eastern prince's missing royal ruby have to do with a traditional family Christmas party at the noble country estate of Abney Hall? Oh, oops, I mean King's Lacey. This is a question that becomes more urgent when a children's hoax seemingly turns deadly. Fortunately, Poirot is among the party to solve all. Victoria, start us off, please.
Well, this is Hercule Poirot at his best, I think. It's sheer indulgence, this short story. It's real nostalgia. And you're not just getting to see King's Lacey. You're seeing into Agatha Christie's own childhood, her own Christmases. You've got all those wonderful traditions there. They're lighting the Christmas tree. They've got all the stockings at the end of the bed. And the food, obviously. Agatha delights in all the feasting. I mean, part of the impossible mystery in this is perhaps how they've eaten all of this food that's there. But the traditions, of course, she doesn't just put them there for show. They mean something. So who stirred the Christmas pudding and made a wish? And you put the trinkets in, of course. You've got the butler's button, you've got the little thimble, you've got a red piece of glass in there. So, yeah, I love this story, and I suspect this is one people return to very frequently, more so than Murder in the Mews.
All right, thank you. Mark.
In my notes that I've got next to me, I've got joyous exclamation mark written next to The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding. It just is. It's so lovely, and it really mixes. You're absolutely right about the nostalgia, but also it's been expanded and updated for the 1960s. So the teenagers go off and listen to and play with their tape recorders. There's this really lovely mixture of sort of modern life, but also traditional life. You can feel Agatha Christie having real fun doing this, and there's great stuff about a fake murder in the middle of it that Poirot's playing along with, and then maybe is behind. There's great character stuff for Poirot. He is, I say this to somebody who wants people to buy my Poirot book, not always somebody you'd actually want to spend time with in the real world, I would say, because he could be perhaps a bit annoying at Christmas. Here he's a delight. You'd love to have him as a guest. It is a wonderful short story, but not as good as Murder in the Mews.
All right. I'll go next. I am going to still stick with Murder in the Mews. I think there are a lot of Agatha Christie short stories, and we're about to get to one in a little bit, where you can make the argument that it's not necessarily about the puzzle or the mystery, it's about everything else that she's doing. And I do see that argument with this story. But for me, the mystery is slight enough that it's just never actually been one of my favorites, even though all of the Christmas celebrating and the fact that it has all of those ties to Christie's own past are definitely, the best thing that I think one can say about it. I will just say that I think it's unfortunate that we don't have the Miss Marple counterpoint to this Poirot Christmas story, a Christmas tragedy, because it would be really great. In this story, Poirot gets a big tree, a feast of a meal, and he even gets a Christmas kiss. Whereas Miss Marple gets poverty, despair, and betrayal. I think it very much tracks, and I actually do like a Christmas tragedy, but I just can't vote for this one. I'm going with Murder in the Mews. John.
And unsurprisingly, I'm going for Murder in the Mews, because while I agree with everything everyone has said, it's all very lovely and seasonal and twee and everything, but for me, you can't beat a good murder. I mean, that's...
Merry Christmas. All right, Jamie.
I thought I was going to be the contrary one because I loved The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding as a reader and as a Christmas thing, but as a short story, I don't think it's that good. There is no murder, for one thing. But also, it's got that sort of indulgence and nostalgia that works so well in Christmas fiction, but doesn't necessarily stand up at other times of year. Murder in the Mews is not my favourite Christie story, but I'm going to stick with it.
I feel similar. Thank you for that caveat, because me neither, and yet it survives every round. Okay, well, Murder in the Mews will continue to battle it out against The Man from the Sea. So this is a Mysterious Mr. Quinn story. First, it was collected in Mysterious Mr. Quinn, which was published in 1930. Mr. Satterthwaite encounters a man at the edge of a cliff on a remote island. This man says he has 6 months to live and has decided to take his own life here by jumping off the cliff. Can Mr. Satterthwaite somehow convince this man not to give up on life and find a happy ending for him? So I will go first again, because we have all gone first at this point. This is the text that I was talking about when I said that there are those stories where Christie does more than just plot a good mystery. The puzzle here is of the slightest construction, and yet the atmosphere that Christie creates is one of her best. It's an atmosphere of loss and longing and regret. It's raw emotion. It's eloquently and movingly conveyed. And it's worth noting that the tableau of a person standing at the edge of a cliff on a remote island contemplating a jump to their death was reproduced almost word for word in Unfinished Portrait, which Christie wrote under the pseudonym of Mary Westmacott. The Mary Westmacotts were extremely personal to her, which is why perhaps it won't come as a total surprise that Agatha Christie herself visited the place where this story is set. It's Tenerife, which is the largest of the Canary Islands, and she visited it at a difficult time of her life. I don't think we need to get into that beyond that statement of fact. There is also actually an arm of the International Agatha Christie Festival that is held every 2 years in Tenerife. So there's just so many reasons to adore this short story, and I am going to vote for The Man in the Sea and finally abandon Murder in the Mews. Mark.
Yeah, so this is one I did nominate, and I didn't nominate Murder in the Mews, and I'm not going to go with Murder in the Mews, I'm going to stick Man from the Sea. But it's worth saying that we were asked what's Agatha Christie's best short story, not what's her best short mystery. And so for me, this as a story is beautifully constructed. It really shows her handle on characterization, which so often many of us will know she was completely unfairly and ridiculously dismissed as somehow not being great at characterization, just being there to put the puzzle mystery together. This is a great way and a big rebuttal of that. It's a meditation about what makes a satisfying life. It works beautifully. I really couldn't recommend it. And indeed, the Mr. Quinn collection, because it's not one of the most well-read ones, really, really strongly recommend it. And also come to Puerto de la Cruz, because John and I and Andrew and other people will be there in November, 13th to 19th. Come along, it's great.
All right, Victoria.
I will go for The Man from the Sea as well. I think it's a very quiet, understated story. The characterization, as you said, is absolutely beautiful in this. And so many different layers of life. So you have the young woman who's in a terrible marriage with this awful man. And it touches on things that you don't expect to see in Agatha Christie. And then losing love, and Mr. Satterthwaite saying, I've got to this awful age in life. He's probably about 30 at this point.
Yep.
I know. I think he's in his 60s, his late 60s, but he's it's a reflection on his life, and he brings this love together at the end, and it's very beautiful, I think. Yeah. So my vote goes for that.
All right, Jamie.
You may stop the competition. This is not only The Man from the Sea, obviously, is not only the greatest Agatha Christie short story, it is the greatest short story ever written. It is. I believe it is just exceptionally beautiful, exceptionally unexpected. We are making it sound quite literary, but it is an extremely easy read with, I think, a strong plot that's very good and entertaining to follow. Mr. Satterthwaite is always a delight to meet and to get into his mind. And what I love is the sheer value of human kindness in this story. And also, I don't think we can overestimate the fact that Christie treats a unmarried parent's relationship with their child as perfectly legitimate and acceptable, which is not necessarily common for the time.
All right, thank you, Jamie. John?
I'm a voice crying in the wilderness, clearly, because, well, as Mark said, Andrew, Mark and myself have been to Tenerife, and the cliff edge still exists, and the house where the woman lived still exists and was owned by an Irish family in yesteryear. But the only bit of the story, I mean, again, I come back to the point, give me a good murder any day over human kindness. I mean, but the only bit of the story that sticks in my mind, and it's a bit like an Agatha Christie twist, but in a romantic sense, is when the young woman is kneeling on the edge of the cliff and she explains that she guesses that everyone watching her is assuming she's praying for her husband's life to be saved, but actually she's not. She's praying not to wish him dead, which I think is a wonderfully macabre. But that's the only bit of it that works for me, so you're all wrong, I'm sorry.
But that bit of misdirection is such a, because it's Christie misdirection and also though so insightful as a character, and it's a very fine point that she's making about the inner turmoil of the workings of these people's minds. It's just,
but it's still not as good as Murder in the Mews.
Well, Murder in the Mews has finally been unseated by The Man from the Sea. So The Man from the Sea is going to go up against Accident. This is quite a pairing. I mean, gentle little story versus Accident, which practically should have the psycho sort of soundtrack, I think, behind it. Okay, so a little bit about Accident here. This was collected in the Listerdale Mystery, which was published in 1934. When ex-Inspector Evans suspects that his neighbor, Mrs. Marrodine, is actually a notorious murderer who killed her former husband, and potentially her stepfather as well, he becomes determined to protect the woman's current husband from becoming her next victim. But who exactly is the cat in this game, and who the mouse? Victoria, let's start with you.
I'm going to vote for Accident, actually. I hadn't read it for a long time, and going back to it again, it's a fabulous story. I love the fact that it's got an arsenic eater in it. Who doesn't love an arsenic eater? And she is a fabulous character as well. And he just happens to see her at the fun fair, and then he doggedly decides to chase down this woman who he clearly thinks is a murderer, and then he goes to her house for tea. And she has special little teacups that she's even saying, you know, oh, I think we might have been putting some arsenic in here. And he still drinks. And it's just beautiful at the end, where her protection of the love that you didn't think she was protecting comes out. I think it's a fabulous ending. So my vote would be for Accident.
Okay. Jamie.
Accident is a brilliant story and absolutely deserves to be better known. It's really good. I feel like it's almost a counterpart to a companion piece, in a way, to Philomel Cottage.
Absolutely.
And it's absolutely keyed into the true crime craze of the 1920s and 30s, which is also obviously a craze now. And that said, The Man from the Sea is the greatest story ever written.
Fair enough. John?
Well, not surprisingly, I get my nice murder in this one. A very clever murder with lots of Christie misdirection. And I don't know how many people know, but it's also a very short play called Tea for Three, a three-hander. And it, unlike a lot of adaptations, it sticks very closely to Christie's story. I think it's a cracker of a story told in, 12 or 15 pages. It's wonderful. So, bye-bye, Man from the Sea.
All right, Accident. I am going to vote for Accident as well, with apologies to the mysterious Mr. Quinn. Ooh, hold on. I've done something strange here to my timer. Here we go. Yeah, I think that I think that it has to be Accident. The thing that I love, actually, that she does here is that she manages to have her cake and eat it, too, in terms of character, but never at the expense of plot. Because what she does is that the ultimate twist of this story is that Mrs. Merrodine both deeply loves her husband and is a serial killer. How Christie is that it's actually moving, where it's like, no, she actually loves this man, and she's also a serial killer who is going to off the nosy inspector. And I feel like that's a trope that is often ascribed to women in a lot of stories, the nosy busybody who gets her own at the end. And I love that she ascribes it to this professional man who won't give up when he really should give up. It's like, why are you still doing this? And he kind of gets his comeuppance, and you're almost on her side in a weird way at the end of the story. And she does all of that in this exquisite little story. So I vote for Accident. Mark?
So I hadn't read Accident for many, many years, and then not long ago I re-listened to your episode of you and Catherine talking about Accident and saying how brilliant it was, and I thought, I absolutely must revisit this, because I sort of wasn't that keen the first time I read it, so I reread it. I still wasn't very keen. For me, the real problem with it is that I feel that lots of people could have written it, and for me the best Agatha Christie stories are ones that only Agatha Christie could have read. And for me it feels like you're saying it has obviously got lots in common with Philomel Cottage, and Philomel Cottage has got lots in common with an awful lot of other things as well. Most famously Gaslight and all sorts of things. And this for me feels like something that you could read in any old sort of thriller mystery magazine by any old person. It's good, it works as a story. For me it's not that special, and the stuff about, the maid doesn't always remember to rinse the poison out from the teacups, oh, what a silly thing, I just can't get over that.
All right, so we have 3 votes for Accident, 2 votes for The Man from the Sea. So Accident is going to win. And thank you for mentioning the fact, Catherine Brobeck adored this story. And it's funny because I remember we titled our episode that it was similar to Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, and also Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find. And for me, that's the ultimate compliment, but I do understand your thought process that if you can compare her to another author, perhaps it isn't her best, because she so often is unique, right? So that's interesting. Interesting critique. All right, so Accident is going to go up against our number 1 title. Drumroll, please. The Witness for the prosecution. This one was first serialized under the title Traitor Hands in 1925, but it appeared under the title The Witness for the Prosecution as early as 1933 in the book collection The Hound of Death. This one almost seems a little silly to summarize, but I'll go ahead since I did it for all the other ones. Leonard Vole seems destined to be convicted for the murder of Miss Emily French, who left all her money to him. And when his own wife, Romaine, agrees to take the stand as a witness for the prosecution, his defense seems hopeless. But all is not as it seems. Jamie, why don't you start us off on this one?
The Man from the Sea. Sorry. I am going to actually, I think, genuinely be the one voice that says the wrong thing here, but I love Witness for the Prosecution. However, I think the play version is eons better than the short story. And what I love about the short story is obviously the twist at the end, but when you compare that to the play version, you see how much more mature as a writer Christie was by that point, in that it's not just plot, but also something deeper and more psychological. You finish the short story Witness for the Prosecution, you think, my goodness, that was clever. You finish the play and you think, my goodness, that was powerful. Or, my goodness, that was long, depending on how much you need the loo. But that said, Accident as a short story, so in terms of its particular genre, Accident is brilliant. Thank you.
Accident. John?
No, Witness for the Prosecution for me, and I take your point completely, Jamie, and as we all, I hope, know, to introduce the extra twist, Agatha Christie had to argue vociferously with her producer and director, and she was right, but I think the kick in the teeth in the last few words of the short story, I can still remember the very first time I read them. It must be 10 or 12 years ago now. It's not just Agatha Christie's best short story, it's one of the best short stories in the entire crime genre.
Mark?
Yes, it's the witness for the prosecution for me. And I completely agree with Jamie that actually I do think the stage play is a lot better because the stage play is so phenomenally good that it almost feels unfair that we have to compare it to anything else. But what for me makes this really special is that it works so well as a short story that it feels completely different in so many ways to the courtroom drama of Witness for Prosecution, the play. And I think that is a sign of how brilliant it is the fact that actually you can play with that premise and have the main twist, at least, presented in slightly different ways and be brilliant in both ways. So yes, it's the Witness for Prosecution for me.
Okay. I'm so glad that you all sort of zeroed in on that issue, because that has always been the issue that I have had with Witness for the Prosecution in general. It's that final ending, because I will be honest with you, for the longest time I had to reckon with the fact that I disagreed with Agatha Christie herself, because I did not like the ending to the play compared to the ending I get in the short story. What I have come to realize, having thought about it more deeply for many years, is that I agree that I think what she's doing vis-a-vis a play and in the medium of theater does work and is what needs to be done for the play version. But my God, I had the exact same experience as John. When I still remember reading the short story, and to me what it felt like was Wile E. Coyote going off the cliff, being like, oh no, and then plummeting down, where I was like, because it's dialogue, it's a line of dialogue when she says, oh no, I knew he was guilty, it's because I was convinced he was guilty. And you're just like, it's so powerful and successful and clever as a short story. So we almost have to divorce it from the play. But as a short story, I think it does deserve the crown. But it is not up to us. It is up to all of you right now, by way of applause, to decide whether accident or oh, did you not go? Oh my God. Victoria, go.
I think because it was fairly obvious which one I'd nominated.
I'm so sorry. I've been skipping around with everyone. I should have just been going in lines. Please, go ahead.
When I got your email to say which is your favourite short story of Agatha Christie, so well, there's no competition. The Witness for the Prosecution. When I read it, I wanted to become a barrister. It's why I became a barrister. It is the most magnificent, not just short story. This plot stands alongside her greatest novels. It's so fiendishly clever, but it uses all of our assumptions against us. Of course, somebody who's giving evidence in court is trying to persuade us that they are telling the truth, aren't they?
Right.
And it uses all our prejudices as well. So she knows, Romaine knows, that she's more likely to be seen as a liar than telling the truth, and she uses that against everybody else. This poor Mr. Mayhern is that, he's fooled, we're fooled. The whole legal system is used against by this one woman who's probably one of Agatha Christie's cleverest characters.
Absolutely.
So for me,
I can't believe I almost skipped over the lawyer who had the best insight into that. I totally agree.
I almost brought the wig, but...
All right, well, it is now going to be up to all of you by showing through your applause which of these top two short stories is Agatha Christie's greatest short story. Let's start with Accident. Who here believes, clap your hands if you believe Accident is Agatha Christie's greatest short story. I knew this would happen. I was talking to John about this earlier today. I was like, this is not going to go the way that the greatest novel episode went.
If it helps, I've changed my mind.
Does anyone think The Man from the Sea should be the greatest? All right, how about The Witness for the Prosecution? All right, we have officially crowned Agatha Christie's greatest short story. There were so many great Agatha Christie short stories that there were just a couple a couple of points that I wanted to mention, some honorable mentions, if you will. And I'm thrilled, actually, that you already mentioned Philomel Cottage, because it would have been criminal, I think, if we hadn't mentioned that short story at some point during this panel. And it really does function very similarly to Accident. They're both rather Hitchcockian. And I mean, that's one of the greatest compliments that I could give it. So just wanted to shout that one out. And then it's really interesting to me that for as highly regarded as The Labors of Hercules is, as a collection. None of the individual stories was nominated. I know, John, that it's your favorite collection. Yeah. I almost nominated The Stymphalian Birds. It came really close, but I ultimately couldn't do it.
The write-in vote.
Here's why. I think that the value of that collection is as a collection.
Yes.
Its impressiveness, I think, lies in its cohesiveness, in its thoroughness, right? Where Agatha Christie actually figured out how to write 12 labors and connect them to modern-day mysteries. So I think it's hard to just pluck one of them out and choose it individually. But that collection surely deserves a shout out, which is why I just wanted to do that. And then also interesting, I think, is the fact that we nominated a bunch of Poirots, a bunch of Marples, a Mr. Quinn, but no Parker Pyne. And I'm fine with this. I'm not a huge Parker Pyne fan, but I was recently reminded of the brilliance of The Case of the Rich Woman in particular. So I just wanted to shout out that one, I think, as another example of Christie's stunning insight into what makes people tick, her sort of psychological insight. At this point, we are done, and I would love to open this up to any questions that anyone has. And I guess,
this one, right?
Am I using, is this the mic that we're using for questions? Yeah. Yes? Okay. I will just, I'll sort of do a little Phil Donahue thing. That reference is going to be lost on many of you, I think, but okay.
Hi, thank you for that. That was a really interesting discussion. I thought it was interesting you brought the ones up at the end, but you didn't mention any of Partners in Crime and Tommy and Tuppence, who I really love. Maybe a controversial opinion. And I just wondered if any of them stood any chance of ever making it onto the list?
Not from me.
I think it's probably telling that it irked me slightly that Parker Pyne wasn't mentioned, but then I didn't mention Tommy and Tuppence. But I'm glad that someone did, because they really do have their fans, and they are an important part of the Christieverse. I do have more affection for them, having gone through the entire canon, than I did when I was a more casual fan. So I appreciate that you shouted them out. Is anyone else a particular fan?
I agree. I would nominate the Man in the Mist, which I think is a wonderfully good pastiche of Father Brown, both plot-wise and atmosphere-wise. I like Tommy and Tuppence. Am I allowed to say that in public? So that would be my nomination for Tommy and Tuppence.
Fantastic. Other questions?
Thank you very much, my friend. My two beloved short stories are The Lemousier Inheritance and 24 Blackbirds. I will hear the opinions of all of you about these stories.
Well, Le Mesurier is a little infamous for being the one short story that was not adapted by David Suchet's Poirot series, isn't that right?
Yeah. Well, it depends how you want to. If you want to count it in the slight sort of the fudgy way they did it, then yes, it's the.
They had a character named Le Mesurier.
And,
the Big Four.
But that one really relies on sort of idea of like a family curse, which you've really got to go with. And either you go with it or you don't go with it. A bit like the Idle House Fastati, actually. Sort of either you embrace it or you don't. And I think for a lot of readers, you don't necessarily. I think that the 4 and 20 Blackbirds, which is a really clever one about a couple of brothers, and maybe like when they died. It's all very, very clever and very good, and I think that is a great story. That would probably be maybe in my top 10. Actually, I think that's a really good one. But it does rely on a bit of suspension of disbelief, and like some of Agatha Christie's other mysteries, you sort of go, did it have to be as complicated? There may have been easier ways for you to get what you wanted out of this particular crime. But yeah, they're both good stories. They're all good stories.
I agree, 4 and 20 Blackbirds is a clever story, but it wouldn't be in my top 20, 25. But I do think it's interesting because that little nursery rhyme gave her 3 books, short stories, Sing a Song of Sixpence, Pocketful of Rye, 4 and 20 Blackbirds. So maybe you like to do Baked in a Pie next year.
Jamie or Victoria, any thoughts?
I like 4 and 20 Blackbirds, but I don't understand if somebody's gone and done all this and they've gone to all this careful plot that they then go out and publicly eat stuff that the bloke didn't ever eat. I mean, this seems ridiculous. That is one of those where it stretches it a little bit too much for me. The family curse thing, though, I thought, it seemed like you said, it's extraordinary lengths to go to. Would somebody do that, then, well, I suppose if they've gone insane, perhaps they might.
They're both good, but Agatha Christie was a really good writer, and she wrote several hundred short stories, or more than 250, wasn't it? And yeah, they're not in my top 10 for sure. Sorry.
I will say I recently did an episode with Karen Pierce, who is right there, who wrote a book about Agatha Christie and food. And I didn't even tell you this, Karen, but I got an email from a listener who was like, you didn't even shout out 4 and 20 Blackbirds in that episode, because we went through the top 10 Christie novels as to food, that use food in an interesting way. And I just hadn't thought of it, but it is true.
Great clue in that one.
It does. There's a great food-based story, so I am a fan of that. And I believe it's one of the later ones, too. I mean, most of those Poirots are really from the 20s, but I think that's one of the later ones that she did. Thank you for highlighting those two. Other questions? Oh, we've got...
Thank you. One of my favourites was on Agatha's list herself, which is brilliant, because it absolutely terrified me the first time I read it, which is The Dressmaker's Doll.
Yes. Oh, yes, I love that.
I was so glad when that doll only kept coming back, and I've got an image of that. I was going to say, what do you think? But you're all nodding at me.
Love
so
it.
I'm like, yes.
I think, Victoria, you seem like a huge Dressmaker's Doll.
I completely love it, for exactly the same reason. I love it when she gets all, and this doll just keeps appearing. And when I read it, I had a doll like that, and I had to put it out of my I mean, it's just, it should be, they should make it into an adaptation if it's not already been made into one. I don't think it has it, The Dressmaker's Doll?
I don't think it has it, Mark?
It's been done for the radio. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah. For the radio, for the radio.
But we need to see that doll. I mean, in my head, I'm so sure like yours. Oh. She's saying, no, we can't ever see the doll. Never see the doll.
I mean, there's an entire franchise, Annabelle, based on a scary doll. You would think that if that could be successful, they could certainly do it.
This one's a powerful doll, though, really powerful doll.
I think the more interesting question is what prompted her to write it, because it's a very late short story. It's one of her last short stories, and she says herself she wrote it in the middle of writing a crime novel, probably Ordeal by Innocence. So why did she suddenly write a book about a haunted, or a story about a haunted doll? For me, that's the more interesting question.
Do we have any idea why?
No, we don't, no.
All right, I think there were a bunch of questions in the back, so let me go back here. We'll get less feedback back here also, which is nice.
Hello. Well, I was going to mention in this 70th year of the Mousetrap, the Three Blind Mice story, which I think uniquely was started life as a play and then became a short story. And it has such a great twist, which obviously we're not allowed to mention. But I wondered if that was ever on anybody's shortlist.
No, because we're in Britain and we're not supposed to acknowledge in this country, because it's not published in this country still. So I think that is a big reason why we don't think of it that much as a short story. Because although you can get it anywhere else in the world, it's not very difficult to track down. It still is not available in the UK officially. So it isn't one I think about that much as a short story. That's a really interesting point, actually. Yeah.
And we couldn't have discussed it either because you're not allowed to give away anything about it.
I considered it because I think it is so important, and it isn't collected in the US, but it's the one story. I haven't covered the story yet for the podcast or the play or anything, but I am going to do that soon. But it's the one story that I'm not going to spoil. I'm just not going to go through who did it and how, even on the podcast, because I really do want to respect that tradition of just not spoiling the Mousetrap.
Which is why Agatha Christie didn't want it published in the UK, isn't it? Because it would spoil the enjoyment of so many people over the last 70 years. Yeah.
Is it anyone's favorite short story, though, actually?
No.
I wish I'd thought of it. I wish I'd thought of it, because when I sent you my shortlist, I actually hesitated for ages over The Dressmaker's Doll and Witness for the Prosecution, which I nominated and then rejected. But if I'd thought of Three Blind Mice, which didn't even cross my mind, I probably would have popped that in.
Other questions? More people back here. Maybe I'll just stay back here.
Sorry to drag you back here. So this is venturing away from the topic of short stories and is just about Agatha Christie as a writer, because so much of Agatha Christie's plots have gained widespread familiarity with people through adaptations, things that have allowed people to become so familiar with her characters and her stories. But because of that, I've always been interested to hear the opinions of people who are familiar with the books themselves, and fortunately we have a room filled with them now. And so my question is, what would you say are some of the specifics of Christie as a writer that you get to pick up on moment to moment that you don't necessarily see translated to other adaptations as much?
Coherence. Most adaptations, and Matthew, you needn't listen to this, most adaptations, certainly in the last 20 years, have been ranged from the abysmal to the appalling. So when you go back to the source material, that's where you see the genius of Christie, not in any of the adaptations, with one or two notable exceptions. So am I a voice crying in the wilderness still?
The thing is that the point of adaptation is that it's adapting, is that you are moving it from one thing to another. And there's a really good question about what is getting lost from Agatha Christie. But what's getting lost from Agatha Christie is not necessarily distinctive to Agatha Christie. It's things like, the voice in which she writes. I mean, you just can't translate that, but that isn't specific to Agatha Christie. And when we think about things like, if we want to stick with crime, Sherlock Holmes, I mean, he's been worse treated over the years than Agatha Christie stuff has. So it's not a distinctive question to Agatha Christie. It's a brilliant question, but you could also ask it really almost any story. But yeah, many of us came to Agatha Christie through the adaptations. I mean, I did, sort of. I'm not quite sure which came first, to be honest. But it certainly cemented my love for Agatha.
Well, in fairness, though, most of the Sherlock Holmes were done very well by Jeremy Brett. Not all of them, because he died, which is a bit of a drawback.
Yeah, but also hundreds that are dreadful from elsewhere.
Oh, no, I know, but they did do definitive versions of most of them.
Oh, yeah, Brett's amazing, yeah.
I have an answer. I think there are two elements, actually. One is that Christie, when she was cluing and creating her puzzles, she really was writing for the written medium. So a lot of her clues are so clever in that they're specifically textual, and they work when you're reading them in a book, or they work when you're imagining them in your head, such as costuming, which she often makes a lot of use of, and it's much harder to pull off a costuming clue when you have to have an actor put on makeup and a hat or a veil or something like that, versus just reading it and it's in your imagination. So that's one thing. And then my biggest pet peeve about adaptations, even though it's not a knock on an adaptation, in any adaptation in particular, is that many of these series, especially the best loved ones, for example, the Suchet series, they compress the timeline of when these mysteries are taking place. Those are all set in and around 1934 to 1936. And for that reason, Christie gets the reputation of someone whose settings aren't real. And the Miss Marples are often set in a 1950s sort of countryside setting. And that just couldn't be further from the truth. When you actually read the texts, they're very much set, the books that are set in the 20s feel like the 20s, the 30s, the 30s. The post-World War II books in particular are so evocative of that time. And the 60s as well, sometimes in, interesting ways, but the books in the 60s are very much interested in depicting the 60s. So she is very much set in a specific time and a place, and I think that gets lost still to this day because the adaptations are so strong in people's minds.
Thank you for your answers.
Sure. There's someone else back here.
Okay, obviously, we've talked about what we think are the greatest short stories tonight. I wonder what the panel think about Agatha Christie's short stories as an entire body of work, I think all 250 or whatever it is. Because particularly the ones that don't feature the regular detectives, there's a large number of them I just cannot understand. I mean, so I'll give you just one example. I mean, The Hound of Death, what on earth is all that about?
I quite like The Hound of Death. It's quite fun. Who doesn't like a nun? It's quite
Sorry, I didn't hear the question. What was the question?
The question was about, specifically The Hound of Death, and maybe we talked about what our favorite short stories were. So are there any short stories that, we might have issues with? And The Hound of Death from the Hound of Death collection was the one that was brought up specifically as one that might not be one of this gentleman's favorites.
Because most of the stories that Agatha Christie herself shows are from the Hound of Death.
They are.
Yeah. And I don't think there's one detective story in it, was there? They were nearly all supernatural.
Well, Death by Drowning was in there.
That's not a detective story. As I pointed out earlier before I was overruled, but anyway.
I mean, I'll just say that I think even in the Hound of Death collection, I've come back to this point so many times, but I think the joy of the short stories of Agatha Christie are that she does different things in them from what she's doing in some of the novels. And it's a short story. So you read, you're reading 10 or 12 pages, and sometimes you might say to yourself, well, that was an interesting experiment, but maybe it didn't work as well as it could have. But I just appreciate that we get this sort of greater breadth of what she was willing to tackle. And for that reason, I love reading all of them, quite honestly.
Oh, yeah.
Anyone else? Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Obviously today you described set collections of short stories. Well, more recently they've been published in new ways. Do you think that distracts from what they originally intended, or do you think it adds a new light to it?
That's a great question. There have been a number of new collections that are sort of collecting different stories previously published, with different themes. I know The Last Seance, Tales of the Supernatural is one of them. There's a love one, I think, as well, that came out recently.
Yeah.
Please.
But what's the question then?
The question is, do we think that is it taking away from the earlier collections? Is it adding something new? What's our general impression of those new collections that are collecting older stories in a different way?
I think something that's really interesting is that now you can just buy one short story for 99p. And I think that's sort of really, because it's this thing that we accept, things like The Hound of Death, which has also got the witness prosecution in it, and death. And John was saying to me earlier, several people said, Death by Drowning doesn't feel like it fits into 13 Problems. Well, because she didn't write the 13 Problems, she wrote these short stories at different times and they get collected. So in our imagination, with a few exceptions, such as The Labours of Hercules, they really are just sort of, these are a good set to push together. I mean, there's loads of questions about why were some of the early Poirot short stories put into Poirot Investigates and some left for Poirot's early cases, which was published 50 years later. And yet she wrote them all in the 1920s. But for us, that makes them different because there's half a century between them, but there really isn't. And so I think there's an artificiality to a lot of the collections. And what I thought was quite interesting was seeing that America collected a lot more short stories than Britain for many decades. And it was actually because her publishers said more than once that they thought that if they could keep having a Christie a year, that was fine, because they actually didn't think the short stories were as good as the novels, and they were a bit worried that especially early short stories being put in collections in maybe the 50s and 60s might sort of pale by comparison with a lot of her other work. And I can sort of understand that, because they're very, very different beasts. That was a really long answer, sorry. But
Great answer. Anyone else? Any thoughts on that, the new collections?
No, I think putting them into themes, it certainly satisfies my OCD. But as Mark said, when you grew up reading them, you still think, as you say, Witness for the Prosecution is in Hound of Death, but there's no reason why it couldn't be in 2 or 3 other collections. Although I do query some of the inclusions, some of the, dark romance or midwinter mysteries. There's a little bit of shoving and squeezing to fit them into that category.
For sale on the table back there, I just saw it earlier today, Midwinter Mysteries, because I thought to myself, what is that again? And then I remembered.
So no, I'm happy with it.
Yeah, I don't think that there's anything necessarily sacrosanct about the earlier collections either, which is very much to your point. So why not keep on collecting them?
Absolutely.
Enjoying them.
Keep buying them.
Question over here.
Yeah, it just occurred to me, I was just trying to think if there are any forgotten short stories, and I'm sure there aren't. But for Dr. Curran, you're an expert in the notes of the notebooks. Were there short stories that maybe never got written that you're aware of that were close? Maybe even in the Mary Westmacott genre, a weird little short story like that or something?
Well, there are lots of, I call them unused ideas, dotted throughout all of the notebooks. So I dotted them throughout both volumes of Secret Notebooks. And there are wonderful ideas there for short stories. And the galling thing is she seemed to rattle them off just like that. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, all the way up to J, K, L, M, N. Probably, as I said in the book, while she waited for the kettle to boil, because she was so prolific and her mind teemed with ideas, but a lot of them she never got around to writing.
What a good source for adaptations.
Well, there's not enough. There might only be one sentence or two sentences. But I would be very surprised if fiction writers in the future don't acquire some of them and turn them into short stories, because they're brilliant ideas.
All right, well, I think with that, we are at an end. I really appreciate again that everyone came. I hope that you enjoyed our spirited balloon debate, and that maybe this will inspire you to read one or several short stories of Agatha Christie that you might not have read before or might not have read in a long while. I know it was a lot of fun to prepare for this, actually, by reading all of these short stories. Thank you so much to all of my co-panelists. I so appreciate you coming on here. And fingers crossed you could listen to this episode in a couple of weeks. We shall see, or maybe not. Thank you again.
And thank you to Kemper.
Well, listeners, I am so glad I was able to bring you that live episode in an audible fashion, unlike last year's live episode. I hope you were able to get a sense of the joy and excitement and real community feeling in the room. A number of listeners came up to me after the presentation and just had such lovely things to say. Hugs may have even been exchanged. I so appreciated everyone who came out for the event, but I know that for many of you, that simply was not possible, and it's really lovely to be able to share the event in this way with all of you. By the way, I can't help myself, but I mentioned when speaking about the Le Mesurier inheritance that the way the Suchet series had woven it into their adaptational landscape was by way of a character named Le Mesurier in one of their episodes. And I think I said that it was in the Big Four episode, but actually it was in the Labors of Hercules episode. That was that grand pastiche of an episode trying to account for all 12 of the Labors of Hercules in about 2 hours, along with the Le Mesurier inheritance. Thank you again. Thank you a million times over to my wonderful co-panelists, John Curran, Mark Aldridge, Jamie Berntal-Hooker, and Victoria Dowd. We had such a great time, and they really brought it. I am so grateful to them for their presence on that evening. Long live the Agatha Christie Festival, which apparently now is going by the simplified name of the Agatha Christie Festival, as opposed to the International Agatha Christie Festival. Wouldn't want you to think I was dispensing with that international on the fly or anything. Well, for my next episode, I am bringing you another conversation that I had at the Agatha Christie Festival this year. A conversation with one of the people you heard from in this episode. That would be Dr. Jamie Berntal-Hooker, who, as I mentioned in my introduction in The Spanish Barn, is both a scholar of Christie and a mystery author. And I sat down with him when we both had some free time to discuss those two very different hats that he wears and how they may interact with each other and other such matters. This was an excuse just to talk to Jamie a little bit more, and I know that many of you adore him as much as I do, and in particular as much as my former co-host, Catherine Brobeck, did. Until then, if you want more All About Agatha, you can head on over to the podcast's Patreon page, www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha. I've provided a link in the notes to this episode. I'll be doing a mini review at the top of October's Patreon episode about the Kenneth Branagh extravaganza, A Haunting in Venice. So if you want to hear my thoughts about that, head on over to the Patreon site. That will be going live on the 5th of October. You can email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can find the podcast on Twitter/X at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. And I would so appreciate it if you could leave a rating and or a review for the podcast if you haven't yet done so. Really, really helps me out. And I'll see you next time. Bye.
Whether you're looking to build a website for your business, your hobby, your podcast, or just for fun, Pear Networks is your go-to web hosting partner. Not only do we have the lowest domain price in the industry, starting at just $11, we've got hundreds of stunning website templates to help you stand out from the crowd. You're not a techie? Not a problem. With our easy DIY site builders, you can launch your impressive website without any technical know-how. And when it comes to security and updates, don't worry, we've got you covered. Our 24/7 US-based customer support is the best in the industry. Check out pair.com today to learn more. PAIR.com.
Ever tried reading while jogging, cooking, or even juggling flaming torches? Yeah, it doesn't end well. But with audiobooks.com, you can conquer books without the circus act. Dive into over 450,000 titles, including more than 10,000 free ones. Get hooked on a bestseller, find your next obsession, or finally read that classic you've been avoiding since high school. And here's the inside scoop. Sign up today for a free 30-day trial and snag your first 3 audiobooks on the house. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.